Charles Goyette Show on KFNX News Talk Radio 1100 AM in Phoenix, Arizona. I'm Scott Horton, filling in for Charles Goyette, America's most independent talk show host, and I'm very thankful for the opportunity to spend this time with you folks in Phoenix, Arizona this morning. I'm doing the best I can here, folks, to make the case against the case for war with Iran. In the first hour, we talked with Dr. Gordon Prather about their nuclear program, and Professor Juan Cole from the University of Michigan, about the correct translation of Ahmadinejad's speech, where he did not threaten to wipe Israel off the map. We talked with Phil Giraldi, former CIA officer from the American Conservative magazine, about how Iran is not friends with al-Qaeda, and no, they are not operationally working together against American interests. And Robert Dreyfus, author of Devil's Game, talked about how the Iranian factions in Iraq are the American factions in Iraq. We're both backing the same side in that godforsaken land. And now to continue thoroughly beating down the war party's excuse for a preventive war against Iran is Gareth Porter. He's a historian and journalist. He writes for IPS News and for the American Prospect. We feature all his IPS articles at antiwar.com. Gareth, good to talk to you again, sir.
Good morning, Scott. Glad to be on the show.
It's great to have you here, and you're going to fill in a very important part of our story here today, this morning. For more than a year, Gareth Porter, for more than a year and a half, actually, even, the Bush administration has been claiming that Iran is responsible for the bombs that are killing our guys in Iraq. Now, the idea that we've all known for 4 years that the enemy of the American GI in Iraq is the Sunni insurgency and not the Shiite factions, which, as we just discussed with Robert Dreyfus, are backed by Iran, seems to be besides the point. The rate and intensity of these accusations has increased incredibly over the last 6 months, and especially even in this last month, as the U.S. Senate just passed last week a sense of the Congress, 97-0, accusing Iran of killing Americans in Iraq and Afghanistan. So, Gareth Porter, tell me, is it the case, as the war party claims on TV, that the new and improved explosively formed penetrator landmines in Iraq must come from Iran?
Well, the answer to that is no, and I can go into more detail on that. But if I may, I would like to sort of cut to the headline here.
Okay.
On this broader story, which is that the 97-0 Senate resolution, which, of course, was introduced by Senator Joe Lieberman, the leading member of the war party in Congress, that is the party of war against Iran, was based on an absolutely false premise, which is that the story that had come out on July 2nd or 3rd, the story was written on the 2nd, published on the 3rd in the New York Times, that Iran was involved in directly and even directed the planning for a raid in Karbala, Iraq, on January 20th, which killed 5 Americans. It is simply utterly false. Not only did the U.S. command spokesman, Brigadier General Kevin Bergner, not provide any evidence whatsoever of such an Iranian involvement in the planning of that attack, but in fact, he did not even say directly that Iran was involved in the planning of that attack. This story is a really remarkable case study in how a story gets created, which has no substance to it, not merely because of the war propaganda of the Bush administration, but because certain, shall we say, overzealous members of the U.S. press corps are overeager to advance certain storylines that the administration favors. In this case, the storyline is that Iran is killing Americans in Iraq, and specifically, the guilty party, the main guilty party, is Michael Gordon of the New York Times. Now, I think many of your listeners will be aware of the fact that Gordon, along with Judith Miller, was the creator or the transmission belt, shall we say, of the Bush administration's key war propaganda theme in September 2002 of the infamous Iraqi aluminum tubes, which were said to be evidence of the Saddam Hussein regime's preparation of nuclear weapons.
Well, that's right. And now let me stop you there. It was Michael R. Gordon and Judith Miller who they wrote an article for the Sunday New York Times in September 2002, and then that Sunday, that very day that it was published and hit print, Dick Cheney, Condoleezza Rice, Donald Rumsfeld, and I forget, maybe General Franks, all went on Sunday morning news shows to say, see, here it is, even in the New York Times.
That's exactly right. I mean, this was an absolutely crucial chess move, if you will, in the Karl Rove Dick Cheney inspired strategy of preparing the American people for war.
And now this is the very same Michael R. Gordon is the conduit for this information again.
Absolutely crucial role in that move, lending the credibility, such as it was, of the New York Times to that storyline. More recently, of course, he was instrumental in advancing the Bush administration's line about the irrefutable evidence that it was Iranian government sources who were responsible for the appearance of the explosively formed devices in Iraq. Now, and I'll come back to that, but I want to focus on this story that the Times published immediately after the press briefing by this Brigadier General Kevin Bergner, the spokesman of the U.S. military command in Baghdad, because I have now obtained a copy of the transcript of that briefing. And what one discovers upon reading that transcript is that the U.S. military command briefer, Brigadier General Bergner, never said directly that Iran was behind the planning or involved in the planning of this January raid on Karbala, which killed 5 American soldiers. What he did was to put forward very cleverly conceived, ambiguous language, which avoided stating directly that that was an Iranian that there was Iranian involvement in the planning of that. And I will read you exactly what Bergner stated from in his briefing. He said that the Hezbollah operative who was captured in southern Iraq, as well, and he was a liaison with this militia group that carried out the attack, and the Iraqi who was said to be in charge of that militia group who did carry out the attack, both of whom were captured on March 22nd. And these are the words of Kevin Bergner. They state that senior leadership within the Quds Force, that's the Iranian Revolutionary Guards organization, knew of and supported planning for the eventual Karbala attack, unquote. Now, this is very indirect language. They knew of and supported the planning. That's very far from stating that they were actually participating in the planning or helped to plan the attack. And Bergner was using this language very carefully and in a very considered manner. He said that knowing that he did not have evidence of Iranian direct involvement in the planning.
And knowing that Michael Gordon would take it and run with it.
Well, not only did he take it and run with it, this is the detail which one discovers from reading the transcript of that, which really gives away the source of this story, the origin of this story. What happened was that because Bergner did not state directly that the Iranians were behind this attack or involved directly in the attack, in planning it, basically Gordon stepped in and offered to volunteer to clarify the story. And here's what Gordon said, according to the transcript. Quote, "What's new here, as I understand it, is that you're asserting the Quds force and the Iranians had specific knowledge of this attack in advance and helped guide and support it, not merely train the force." In other words, he was prodding Bergner to say that the Iranians were directly involved in the planning. So then Bergner refused to respond to that statement by Gordon. He refused to respond to the statement by Gordon, and instead he answered a different question, whether the purpose of it was to capture American soldiers in the hope of trading them for detained Iraqi officials, as had been suggested by Gordon. And then so Gordon then tried a second time to get him to state that it was the story of Iranian help and guidance for the January attack. He said the specific motivations behind these operations. He said that you're asserting essentially the Quds force directed and helped plan this attack in Karbala. That was Gordon stating that, not Bergner. Uh-huh. So Bergner then responded, "That is what we learned from," and then he named the person who had been one of the people captured and interrogated. But he never stated it directly, and by insisting on indirect language, Bergner was staying out of the, not taking responsibility for that charge. Mm-hmm. Essentially, this is a story that was written by Michael Gordon himself.
Mm-hmm. So what a case study in the stovepipe. There you go. You have this guy, General Bergner, who actually just finished working in the White House, who then goes to Iraq and gives this big press conference in front of Michael R. Gordon, and then Michael R. Gordon prints it up on the front page of the New York Times, making all kinds of wild accusations, and then Joe Lieberman picks it up from the New York Times, and the next thing you know, you have a vote of 97-0 in the United States Senate saying that Iran is killing our troops and we're not happy about it.
That
which,
is
of course, means that if Dick Cheney starts bombing them next week, he can say, see, even Hillary Clinton and everybody else said that they're already at war against us. We're going to continue this conversation with Gareth Porter right after this break. You're listening to the Charles Goyette Show on 1100 KFNX in Phoenix, Arizona. All right, everybody, welcome back to the Charles Goyette Show. I'm Scott Horton, having a great time filling in. Scott Horton from antiwar.com, that is. Don't forget to say that, Scott. I'm having a great time filling in for Charles Goyette, the most independent talk show host in America, who I hope is sleeping in this morning and enjoying his vacation. I'm on the phone with Gareth Porter. He's one of my favorite investigative reporters. He's also a historian who's written a gigantic arm full of books. He writes news for IPS News Service and for the American Prospect, among others. And I want to go ahead and take this phone call from Paul in Scottsdale. Real quick, though, Paul, because I got a ton of truth I need to wring out of this guy before the top of the hour. Go ahead.
That's what my phone call is all about.
All right.
You guys are a breath of fresh air, and Charles is in danger of losing his title as America's most important or independent talk show host.
Oh, come on.
You guys are terrific. Listen, all of these guys you were mentioning, Bergner, Miller, Gordon, Lieberman, isn't it true they're all of the Israeli persuasion?
Gareth Porter, what do you say?
I have no idea about Kevin Bergner. I have no idea. I actually don't know. I'm sorry. I'm not familiar with the backgrounds of these people. I don't know that it matters that much because this is not really simply a matter of for those people who are pro war with Iran. Obviously, Israeli interests are one of the issues behind this. No question about that. But let's face it, there are other interests that are supporting war with Iran as well. I mean, this is a much broader problem than simply Israeli interests. Although, I certainly would not disagree that that's a very important element.
Yeah, and I think when you look at people like Michael Gordon, it seems to me from any of his reporting on no matter which subject, he just, wants to be famous and doesn't care how much truth makes it into his news stories as long as it gets to the front page. Seems to be what matters to him most.
Well, I think, Gordon obviously is an ambitious reporter, and I think you're right about that, Scott. But at the same time, he clearly has an ideological agenda as well. He's leaning over backwards or leaning forwards, as the case may be, for, to find evidence that would justify aggressive military action. I think that's part of his background.
Right. Okay. Now we got the callers stacking up here, Gareth. But before we get to them, I need to ask you specifically about the explosively formed penetrators.
Yes.
And I'm going to go ahead and do my little bit of debunking before I pass it off to you. The War Party, the bureaucrats, and the people in the media just use this refrain that these new and improved explosively formed penetrators, which are better landmines than the average IED in Iraq, must be coming from Iran. And now I have a major assertion to make along those lines, which is that Reuters and the Christian Science Monitor both reported on April 10th of this year, 2007, that Lieutenant Colonel Scott Blackwell, during an operation called Black Eagle in Diwania province, found a factory that makes these explosively formed penetrators about 100 miles south of Baghdad. And so, there you go. They must not be coming from Iran because here they are being made in Iraq, according to Lieutenant Colonel Scott Blackwell in Reuters and the Christian Science Monitor. Slight parentheses, the Washington Post censored that part of the story from their version of the Reuters reprint there. But
right.
Tell me what you know, Gareth Porter, investigative reporter.
Well, right, and the point that you're making clearly contradicts one of the key points that Michael Gordon, among others, in his reporting, emphasized repeatedly, that the U.S. command, U.S. officials in Baghdad, say that they have no evidence that these particular IEDs have been manufactured or made in Iraq, and that clearly is not the case. And my own source for this was a private security contractor who had been working, doing research on this question of IEDs in Iraq for a couple of years, and said, well, he simply couldn't understand why the U.S. officials were saying that they couldn't find evidence of this, because he thought it was quite clear that there was evidence that they were being manufactured in Iraq. But let me just very quickly take a broader angle on this problem, because I think we don't want to just view it from the very narrow evidence point of view. The larger point that needs to be made, and which is constantly missing from news coverage of this question, is that what's really going on here is that Shiite militias have the opportunity to obtain these on the black market and the motivation to obtain them. And, what they're really getting from Iran, and this has been shown, this has been well documented, is that they have been getting financing from Iran ever since the appearance of the Shiite militias in Iraq in 2003, when the United States invaded and created the opportunity for the Shiites to come back from Iran. They have been getting Iranian money. Everyone has known it. It's been basically accepted from the very beginning. They're using that money to help buy the weapons that they need. It's very simple, very straightforward, and there's no conspiracy involved in it.
Mm-hmm. And as we just discussed with Robert Dreyfus, Iran backs the same factions in Iraq that we're backing. The IEDs that are killing our guys are being set off by the Sunni insurgency, right?
Well, most of them have been, exactly. I would simply make the point that when Shiites do, the Shiites are also resisting U.S. troops, no question about it. But that's not an Iranian policy, that's the Shiite policy.
All right, everybody, Gareth Porter. We'll be right back.
KFNX News Talk Radio 1100 presents The Charles Goyette Show. To be a part of the program, call 602-277-KFNX. That's 602-277-5369. And now filling in for America's most independent talk show host from Anti-War Radio at antiwar.com, here's Scott Horton.
Good morning, everybody in Phoenix, Arizona. From Austin, Texas, I am Scott Horton from antiwar.com, filling in for Charles Goyette, the most independent talk show host in America, here on the Charles Goyette Show, 1100 AM KFNX News Talk Radio in Phoenix, Arizona. And we're talking about today's top story, Lindsay something or other TV star's drinking problem. Oh, wait, no, we're not. We're talking about the case against the case for war with Iran. And before I let Gareth Porter off the line here, I appreciate you staying over, Gareth. I have a couple things I want to wrap up with you real quick before we go to the phones and then to antiwar.com's Justin Raimondo. Very quickly, Gareth Porter, tell me whether it is a fact that every time the vice president's office leaks some rumors about Iran arming and equipping the Taliban fighters in Afghanistan who are killing our guys in that country, is it true or is it false that every time that happens, someone from the military comes out and says, no, that's not really true?
Military in Afghanistan is concerned because they are, of course, in the front line, and they know that the threat that they face is not from Iran or Iran's proxies or allies. It's from the allies of the Pakistanis. That is to say, the pro-Taliban forces in the border provinces of Pakistan. So they don't appreciate the effort to really detract from the threat that they face by talking about a completely fictional threat from Iranian assistance to the Taliban, because that's simply, they know that's not true. I must say, however, that the U.S. command in Baghdad is a different story. As we now see, there are very close ties between that command and the White House. They're really one political team, so that the U.S. command in Baghdad is really, part of the game plan of the Bush administration and the vice president all the way. Okay.
So there's another one debunked. And now let's move on real quick here to the peace offer of 2003. I think you've done the most and the best reporting about this. The Iranians in 2003, I believe shortly after the American invasion of Iraq, sent the Swiss ambassador to the United States to deliver a message saying that they wanted to offer, basically put everything on the table and try to restore full relations with the United States. Is that right?
Well, that's right. I mean, they were after what they called the Grand Bargain, what has been called the Grand Bargain, which means that all of the issues that divide the U.S. and Iran should be on the table, and find a way to satisfy the basic legitimate interests of both sides, which could involve definitely some kind of agreement with Israel to offer ultimate recognition to Israel on the same terms that the Arab states have offered it, which was an explicit part of that deal. Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, my point about this right now, because, of course, U.S. and Iran representatives, diplomats, are now talking today in Baghdad about the situation in Iraq, is that Iran clearly is still just as interested in reaching a grand bargain as they were then. They're interested in it because they want legitimacy, they want their security interests and their political interests in the region recognized, and they need the United States to do that. Now, of course, they're concerned about policies by the United States, and they want change in those policies, and that's why they want to negotiate with the United States.
Mm-hmm. And they even offered to rein in Hamas in the West Bank and Gaza, and rein in Hezbollah in Lebanon, put their nuclear program on the table, help us fight al-Qaeda. What else?
All of those things are on the table as part of a deal in which the United States agrees to stop its aggressive policies toward Iran and towards other parts of the Middle East.
Yep. Okay, now, real quick, Dave, if I can get you to play this clip. Gareth, listen to this clip of Norman Podhoretz, Rudy Giuliani's new senior foreign policy advisor.
Well, if we were to bomb the Iranians, as I hope and pray we will, it will unleash a wave of anti-Americanism all over the world that will make the anti-Americanism we've experienced so far look like a love fest. On the other hand, that's a worst-case scenario.
Yeah, that's the worst-case scenario. What do you think? There's the war party. Norman Podhoretz hopes and prays America will bomb Iran, and yet freely admits that the likely consequences for the United States of America would be an absolute disaster, one that he says would make our current situation in terms of anti-Americanism around the world look like a love fest.
Well, my view is that Norman Podhoretz represents a very unfortunate and very sad phenomenon, which is a kind of death wish on the part of certain very extreme right-wing people who are in favor of war. I mean, it's really, they sort of say, bring it on, bring on death. That's what we want, and I think it's a very sad commentary on this country that they still are listened to.
Now, William S. Lind, a military strategist, wrote an article for the American Conservative magazine called How to Lose an Army. And basically the subheadline was Surge and Dig into Iraq and then Bomb Iran. And his point was, and he quotes in there Muqtada al-Sadr, the leader of the Mahdi army, who we know are the nationalists and least tied to Iran of the Shiite factions. And also he quotes Abdulaziz Hakim as saying, in the event of an American war against Iran, quote, we would do our duty. Does that sound to you, Gareth Porter, like if America bombs Iran, that our soldiers in Iraq are basically a couple of 100,000 Iranian hostages?
Of course they are. We have to recognize the fundamental reality in Iraq is that the Shiite majority and its political military leadership are inherently allied with Iran. They are inherently allied with Iran. When the chips are down, when Shiite interests are at stake, and they do regard Iran as a Shiite country and as fundamentally an ally religiously of the Shiite faith in Iraq, they will side with Iran. There's no question about that.
There's some very real consequences that our guys might face. All right, I have to move on from here. Thank you very much. Gareth Porter, everyone, from IPS News, and he writes for the American Prospect. You can find him at antiwar.com/Porter. Thanks again, Gareth.
Always a pleasure.